Hello and welcome back to the Harbor Online Community YouTube channel. I'm Jon, and I'm joined today by our community administrator, Stacy Dyerly, making her debut on the YouTube channel. How are you doing today, Stacy?
Hey, I'm great, Jon. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super happy to sub in and get to talk to everybody.
Awesome. Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about our most recent Harbor gathering. At the time of this recording, our most recent gathering, we just wrapped up our series of discussions on the book of Acts, and we ended on chapter 17. And I sort of presented the content portion at the gathering. So I'm going to give a brief summary of that now. And then, Stacy, we will just chat briefly about the discussion that took place at the gathering. Um, so Acts 17 is a somewhat famous part of Acts. The Apostle Paul, winds up in Athens, a leading city in Greece at the time, within the bounds of the Roman Empire. And he's preaching in the synagogues, he's preaching in the marketplaces. And some of the philosophers, the Stoics and Epicureans, they take notice of his words. They bring him to this place, the Areopagus, I think is how you say it. And he gives a very compelling, oft quoted sermon where he is looking around. He sees the idols that are being worshipped in the city. He starts from that observation, talks about the creation of the universe, the nature of the divine, the fact that God is not contained in these statues and these human-made objects, and quotes Greek poets to talk about how God is close to us and we can know God, and then brings it home with this idea that in fact God raised someone from the dead, this who is coming to judge us all, Jesus. And so we looked as usual at the commentary on Acts by Willie James Jennings, and some of the themes that we highlighted that I thought were really helpful for me. One is the idea that the main character in this story, yes, you could say it's Paul, but it's Luke's Paul. Something that Jennings always says, Luke's Paul. And just this idea that we don't have any kind of direct, unmediated access to the historical figure, the Apostle Paul, who walked the earth. We have a bunch of letters, and they claim to be written by someone named Paul. Some of these letters, scholars think, were written by a historical Apostle Paul. And many of the other letters, scholars think, no, there's little to no chance that Paul actually wrote the letters in the New Testament, a lot of them that say they're written by Paul. And then we have the figure of Paul who appears in these stories that Luke is telling in the book of Acts. And we don't have to try to merge all these different variations on Paul in our head. And so if we have baggage, a lot of us at Harbor have baggage around Paul, largely from the epistles that bear his name and a lot of the ways that they've been used and taught in our own lives in churches. And so a lot of us have complicated or really negative feelings about Paul, but this is Luke's Paul in this story. This is not an actual flesh and blood person who wrote letters that harmed us. This is a figure in a story. Luke is crafting a narrative. Another important point that I think that Jennings brings up is a question that Jennings asks about the social context. Who is Paul, and in what context is he preaching this sermon? Paul's a Jewish person, a diasporic Jew living under Roman military occupation, and he's preaching an evangelistic sermon. Many of us at Harbor talk about baggage. I mean, evangelizing, proselytizing, trying to convert people. This is really tough stuff for a lot of us, myself included. But I think this question from Jennings is helpful because when you think about evangelism that's really problematic in history, it's when the flow of power and coercion from empire is flowing in the same direction as the evangelism. When Portuguese or Dutch colonizers, when European settlers arrive on new continents with the power of the state behind them to conquer, and they also have Bibles and they're setting up churches and they're sharing the gospel, you have mission and conquest happening arm in arm in the same direction. In this passage in Acts 17, you have a Jewish person, so a person in the margins, is preaching a gospel message to the empire, to fellow Jews and to Greeks in the marketplace. A really interesting, a different kind of context than a lot of the problematic ones we think of when we think about why evangelism can be so destructive. So those were some of the themes we looked at. We read the chapter, we read some of the commentary from Willie James Jennings, and I thought we had some really interesting conversation. I'm curious what maybe stood out to you or what lingered with you from the stuff that we looked at.
Yeah, I mean, especially as you're talking about now, Paul being a Jewish figure in the diaspora and also um, dealing with the Greeks in the marketplace. That was something that came up in our discussion in our breakout room. You had talked about how, according to Willie James Jennings, there are a lot of, throughout the centuries, a lot of Christians have looked at this in an anti Jewish light. Um, particularly Acts 17, how we've looked at that in an anti-Jewish light. And that was new thinking for many of us in our breakout room, and we didn't really completely have a grasp on where he was coming from with that. So I'm wondering if you could explain more about that concept of this being an anti-Jewish chapter.
Yeah, totally. And this may not be in a type of interpretation or reading that everyone out there has come into contact with, but I certainly have. So there's ways of reading this chapter where you read the story, and what we tend to focus on are all the little details of Greek culture, Greek people, Greek places, poetry, philosophy. So we're given a little lesson on the Stoics and the Epicureans. We're talking about which poet was Paul quoting and what more happened in the body of that poet's work. We're talking about all the different aspects of Greek thought and life and historical context. And it really becomes about the Greek context, the Greek culture, much more than anything Paul is doing in the passage, than the sermon that's being preached, than the theological work that's being done. And Jennings says that a lot of this is because we're fascinated with Greek and Roman culture as part of a European obsession that many folks have in the West. And I think about, I didn't we didn't mention this at Harbor, but I don't know if you saw there's this social media trend a few months back where women were asking the men in their life, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And they were giving absurd answers like daily. You know what I mean? Like how does that have anything to do with our lives? But the obsession with the Roman Empire, it's like the same thing as the obsession with ancient Greece, right? This idea that like this is classical Western culture that we revere. And I think the real issue for Jennings is that it makes us think the Greeks are in some ways better than the Jews in first century ancient Near East. There's a certain like we identify with Greeks because we're Western. And so our own cultural chauvinism, our own idea that like America's the best or wherever we're from, it bleeds over into our reading of the text. And we think that the Greeks are really sympathetic. They really resonate with us in this passage. Whereas the Jews, meh. And so that's kind of the type of reading that Jennings is talking about, which he says in reality, the story is about God doing an incredible work in this sermon, this miraculous sermon, as Jennings calls it, being preached by a Jewish man, being recorded by a Jewish storyteller and historian, Luke. And so it's Jewish through and through, but to read it and to say like those Greeks, you know what? They were spiritual geniuses. They were so close just from their own unenlightened philosophy and poetry. It turns out it was just so good, their own creative work, their own thinking, that all they needed was this little tiny nudge from Paul, and there they arrived at the full gospel understanding. And I think that is what is going on with Jennings and his description of these anti-Jewish readings of the text.
Yeah, I think that was some new information for some of us in the breakout room where we never thought about it that way or heard that before. So that was a really cool moment for me. Um, kind of on the other end of the spectrum because that's a fairly like good, strong scholarly argument and good academic learning that we had there. But sometimes what really gets me is the personal discussion or the more personal aspect of a discussion in a breakout room. And so, building on some of what Jennings said, also about this passage, you asked the question about us getting into theological arguments. Had we ever gotten into theological debates, and what the cost of that was to our humanity, individually and collectively? And I found that to be just a really powerful discussion. Made me really reflect for me on times when I've done that, especially coming out of evangelicalism, and having been someone who's definitely sacrificed the humanity of others on the altar of being right. Um, so I wondered if you had any more thoughts about that, this part of the discussion we had too.
Thanks for that question. You and I, it turned out we're in the same breakout room, and many people are calling it the best breakout room of the night, maybe of all time. But I know that you and I both really resonated. That really resonated with both you and I as people who have been on Facebook after leaving evangelicalism, and from time to time have gotten drawn in the past, have gotten drawn into debates, arguments, and I think what I read when I read that in Jennings and when we talked about it at Harbor, I just thought about like we care so much about being on the correct side of the argument. So we're really proud of ourselves when we go from like arguing conservative, maybe toxic, maybe dehumanizing in the past side of an argument or perspective. And then we realize, oh, there's much better ways of thinking and being and loving. There's better theology out there. Now I'm going to argue the same exact way, but now I'm on the other side. Now I'm arguing for this liberating, humanizing, loving like theology. And I do think that's a better perspective, certainly to try to embody and to articulate. But the problem isn't just which side of the argument we're on. The problem is the activity that we are engaging in these aggressive, competitive debates with logic, debates with history, scripture, reasoning, and just trying to dominate or attain some kind of victory, an embarrassing victory, if we can, embarrassing to our opponent, if we can, where we really school them and we really show everyone what a fool they are publicly. I mean, that's what's happening in these debates, right? And that's bad. That's not a good use of our time most of the time. Now, engaging with people who disagree with us, respectfully listening, trying to be clear, trying to come to better understandings, maybe one or both people will shift their views. That is, I think, very much worthwhile, something we should probably take more advantage of if we have the opportunity. But when it becomes an I have to win, I'm right, you're wrong, it's not just about which side you're on. It's that we probably most of the time are better off not participating in that kind of activity. Um, it's not truth is not determined or really discovered by like who had a better rhetorical flourish and who remembered the key Bible verse to bring in at the right moment. I mean, this is just not the way we learn and grow and move forward. So yeah, I really enjoyed that part from Jennings as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing Jennings to us in this series. It's been really great 7 weeks, and Jennings has given us a lot to think about. So thank you so much. And thanks to you and Don and Dottie for a great series on Acts. And thanks for talking today.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. And I'm glad you thought it was a good 7 weeks. Others said, and I quote, "Thank God it's over." So, but thanks for chatting today, Stacy.